I want to try to clarify an aspect of the miracle of Purim tonight, a philosophical aspect, and then, if time allows, I'll broaden the context to see how it fits into a historical progression of miracles. Yeah, it's working? Yeah, okay. There is a strand of Jewish literature which describes the miracle of Purim as one that took place within nature, rather than by contradicting nature or breaking nature. Lucius Levi, for example, has a long essay on this subject. Now, at first glance, that's a bit challenging. Don't we normally contrast miracles versus nature? Don't we think that if something happens and it can be explained on the basis of natural phenomena, natural forces, natural laws operating, then we don't call it a miracle? So how could you have a miracle that takes place within nature? Let's sharpen this a little bit by giving a definition of miracle. It's also a complicated subject, and there are different definitions for different purposes. But here's one definition that's quite widely applicable. A miracle is an event that shows divine agency. A miracle is an event that shows divine agency, meaning any honest, open-minded observer will admit that there's divine agency going on. Of course, this makes a miracle a matter of how the event strikes an honest, open-minded observer. But I think, as I said, this is one of the standard definitions of miracle. And now if we use that definition, you see right away there's going to be a conflict between miracle on the one hand and nature on the other hand. Because if an event takes place and you can explain it in natural terms, it doesn't show divine agency. It might be, but it doesn't show it. No one is required to admit divine agency upon watching the sunrise or the rainfall or the growth of a frog, because we have ways to explain this in natural terms. So somebody wants to talk about a miracle within the scope of nature, he's got some explaining to do. Let me start with a very simple example to set the background, and then I'll push miracle into that context. Let's imagine someone flipping a coin. Let's say you give him the coin out of your pocket, and he's flipping it. And it's coming up heads. It's coming up heads every time. How long is it going to take before you become a little suspicious? Something happened there. 15 in a row? 25 in a row? 50 in a row? Now, of course, no matter how many he gets in a row, it's always probable that it's just an accident. All each flip does is divide the probability in half. 50 heads in a row is 1 over 2 to the 50th power. That's still a finite probability. There is a probability that will happen, even with using a fair coin, undisturbed fair coin. It's just very unlikely. At what point do you become suspicious that maybe it isn't just normal, uninterrupted or uninfluenced chance? At what point would you give better than even odds on the next flip being heads? 70 in a row? No, it's 50-50. I'll bet you even money. I'll bet other people will bet you even money. They'll be happy to bet you even money. At a certain point, you become convinced that something abnormal is going on here. Okay. Now you call for an investigation. You hire the physics department of Stanford University to come in and explore the environment to try to explain this. They take the coin and they weigh it for its balanced center of gravity, and they check for magnetic fields and radioactivity, and then they check for magnetic fields in the room that could pick up traces of magnetic metal in the coin, and hidden air currents that are blowing in ways that you don't notice, and the pressure of photons, they go to town, maybe relativistic effects. And they come back a month later with a long report. We can't find anything. Now at this point, you have 2 or 3 options. One thing you could say is, well, then it's just an accident. Accidents do happen. The probability of 50 heads in a row is 1 over 2 to the 50th power. That's a finite fraction. Could happen. Another thing you could say is, well, there must be something about the natural world that we're missing. The Stanford Physics Department is using all of its knowledge of the natural world. But we are discovering now that there's something in the natural world that we didn't anticipate. Something's got to be causing this to happen. It's just not credible that after 50 heads in a row, the next one's 50-50. I just have to admit our ignorance that there's something beyond what the physics department of Stanford University can test that's going on here. And there's a third possibility, and that is that there's nothing in the entirety of what we call nature that will explain what's going on here. And there's something else that goes beyond nature that's going on here. How would you try to make up your mind between those two? Well, suppose you took not just the Stanford University departments of knowledge of all natural phenomena, some of which are simple and some of which are repetitive and some of which are rare and some of which are complex and subtle. But suppose you did it with something which was a very simple system. Let's suppose instead of flipping a coin, you measured the spin of an arbitrary particle, whether the spin is up or down. And it's supposed to be 50-50. It's always been 50-50. When you take arbitrary particles, it averages out to 50-50. Aha, not this time. This time they all come out, spin up. All come out, spin up. One after the other. Brand new one each time. The old ones you put in a barrel. So somebody says, well, there's got to be something wrong with this spin detector. Maybe this spin detector has only one outcome, up. No matter what the spin is, it just says up. And it's just not really measuring spin at all. But as far as you could tell, this spin detector is identical to all other spin detectors. And there's nothing, you can shield it from external influences, and you can shield it from all types of radiation, all types of energy. Nothing's coming in, nothing's going out. It's the same kind of thing. And so suddenly, it all comes spin up. This is a very simple experiment. There isn't a lot of stuff here. It's one particle at a time. And spin is supposed to be a fundamental property of particles, and for arbitrary particles, it's supposed to be 50-50. At this point, you might think, well, these laws govern how the most simple, fundamental pieces of nature work. It's not as if you're going to find a dinosaur exhaling in the next room and that expects to spin into particles. That's not going to happen. If this isn't working right, then our whole picture of how the system works is under attack. Now, if our whole picture of how the system works is under attack, you're not now hoping for an explanation in terms of something in the picture. Because all the other things in the picture are built out of things like this. This is the simplest piece of the picture. This indicates that there's something wrong with the structure of the whole picture. And that being the case, you have to opt for something outside the whole picture. Now somebody says, but listen, Rabbi, you said yourself that for each particle, the spin is even odds, up or down. So couldn't it happen within our picture that it's just a very unlikely coincidence that all the ones you got with all those tries were up? Yes, it could. It could happen. But on the other hand, I don't think it's appropriate to say, so therefore, if I have my picture of how the system works in its simplest terms on the one hand, and 50 in a row on the other hand, the only option is to say that it's an accident. I don't see any logical reason to say that at least the other possibility should be taken seriously, which is the whole picture, fundamentally, the whole picture is at least incomplete. Something else is going on that we didn't take into account. You don't want to make it impossible to discover that there's something else, do you? You don't want to adopt a rule of thought which, under real conditions, would make it impossible for you to discover that there's something beyond your picture. That wouldn't be reasonable. At a certain point, the evidence should lead you to reconsider. Now, what shall we call this? Well, I think we should distinguish two different ways that an event can violate nature. One way an event can violate nature is that, according to the rules of nature that you believe in, this particular event is just impossible. The present scientific picture of the world is conservation of mass energy, not accounting quantum effects. Conservation of mass energy. You can start an experiment with a certain amount of mass energy, and you make sure there's a shielded system, a closed system, and you do what you like, juggle things around and smash things and so on and so on. If you measure the mass energy at the end, it's going to be exactly the same as the beginning. That's what always happens. No matter how complex the experiment, no matter how different the experiment, no matter what things you try to use, it always ends up that the same amount of mass energy is available. And now, you perform an experiment and there's an extra pound of stuff, or a pound of stuff is missing. When that happened in the 30s, when some stuff was missing, they bet that they were missing something escaping, and they calculated what it should look like, and then they found it, which was a tremendous triumph of a scientific picture. It just can't be that it's violated. Can't be. So now, if you have something like that, and it works under all possible conditions, and then you take a condition which is identical to one that's been done thousands of times, always with the same result, and you get a grossly different result, that's a good case for something that breaks the laws of nature. If you're looking for something external to the picture that's operating, that's waving a flag. In every other identical case, it happens this way, and you've built fundamental laws on that basis, and you can explain everything that happens. And now this one works out differently, then that's going to tell you that your picture is an incomplete picture, an inappropriate picture. That's what I would call a miracle that breaks nature. Miracle that anyone who understands what's going on says right away, this is something that's beyond nature. It's like the parting of the sea, crossing the Red Sea, where the sea split, or like the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire leading them through the desert, or leading manna that falls every night from heaven, every night from heaven except on Shabbos. These are things which you look at them and you know what you know about the world, and you say, this is not a world event. This is something other than the world operating. That's the standard type of miracle. There, any honest, open-minded person who hears it predicted before it happens, every case is a case which Moses predicted before it happened. And it happens at his prediction. is something which a person will say, that's not part of this world. That's not part of this world. But that's not like what we're talking about. Yeah.
Is there a distinction between the types of miracles in which there's some probability of happening, and in other words, there's a natural explanation for it, but it's just a very slim natural explanation, and types of miracles like I imagine manna falling from the sky, which I can imagine a natural explanation for.
For what?
Let's say the manna falling from the sky. Or are there certain miracles which don't have a natural explanation?
Yes, I'm making that distinction. That's precisely the distinction that I'm making. Because with a flipped coin, or with the up and down spin of the particles, there is a probability of it's happening within the natural sphere. So I'm saying that, remember, what are we doing now? We're trying to figure out a meaning for the idea of a miracle within nature. And I said that when you take the definition of miracle as something which a person will have to admit is divine agency, that seems to be a contradiction to nature. Because if you could explain it naturally, then you wouldn't admit that it was a divine agency. You wouldn't have to.
Miracles, technically? I'm saying it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference that both would be miracles, right?
Both of
Maybe I should specify this here. The things that have a very low natural probability could still be miracles.
Yes, that's my point. That's where I'm going. Right? Now, so if it's a single event which, from pointing to the natural picture, is impossible and happens, then right away you're going to say that it's an external agency. If it's something which has a very low probability of taking place, you could still save the natural picture by saying this is just one of those very low probability events. It's all an accident. You could say that. But then, if you're reflective, you think, if I keep this up, if I have this as a principle, this is my principle of logic. Whenever it has a finite probability, no matter how low, I always choose that option. And I never admit that it's something external. Then you make it impossible for yourself to discover that something external is operating just because you've decided never to credit that. That does not seem to be a justified principle of making up your mind, principle of belief. At a certain point, you naturally think, well, it's just gotten too improbable to take seriously, and I'm going to opt for the idea that there's something external, at least as a credible alternative. I'm not going to rule it out. So here, you can't point to a law that's been broken. Which law was broken? All you had was that particles have spin, and as far as we know, they're distributed 50-50, because usually when we measure them and we keep track, it's roughly a 50-50 distribution of up and down spin. This time it isn't. Well, we might just have gotten all the up ones. You know, like Maxwell's demon, for those who know what that is. Right? All the particles end up on one side by accident. Could happen. So in this case, you can't say, here's a law, and the law says this can't happen, and it happened, so the law is violated, and that's why it's external agency. But the sum total outcome becomes too difficult to accept within the framework, in which case you say, I'm not going to go with the probability being, with a very small probability event taking place. I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to check for something else that's responsible for it. And one test of your attitude would be, if you could think of something that's within the natural realm but different from your picture, would you go for that? Now, if you say, oh yeah, if it were natural, I'd go for it. It's just not, I'm not going to go for something that's beyond nature. Why exactly not? Are you rightfully convinced that it's more likely your natural picture is incomplete and there's more natural stuff you haven't discovered than it is that there's something beyond your picture of nature altogether? How would you make a probability of that? How would you know which mistake was more likely or less likely? So now, I think the point that these authors want to make is that the miracle of Purim, unlike I think any other miracle in our history, has this character. It has the character of being events. Each event taken singly is certainly within the realm of accidental history with no particular direction, no particular management. It's only the sum total of the events and their progress towards a goal which defies a natural explanation. Now here we're talking about history, human history, and I don't think there's anything else remotely resembling this sequence of events in human history. And that being the case, it's extremely unlikely to be the kinds of factors that we recognize that are relevant to the events that take place in human history. And if it isn't that, it's certainly not going to be some extra chlorine gas leaking in from the seafloor. So then it's going to be something which directs these events of human history. Now, let me summarize for you the story in the Megillah and show you how this is true. Those of us who are doing it in the text of the Megillah at 6:30 are going to do it in some much greater detail. But let me summarize for you the events that took place in the Megillah. And I want you to try the following sort of mental experiment. As we go through them, see if you agree with me that each one, taken by itself, doesn't attract particular attention at all. Not particularly persuasive at all, each one singly. But when you take all of them together, and especially you take the end result, not only is the end result wildly improbable, but the end result forces you to go back through the whole sequence to the beginning and reinterpret the status of the other elements in the sequence, so that now you see a coordinated sequence, and then it becomes inescapable that this is not a matter of just a very low probability event taking place. So, you have at the beginning of the Megillah the 6-month bash. And during that party, at the end of the party, it's an extra week, the people in Shushan, and then the king commands that Vashti to be brought in front of him, and she refuses, and it's a crisis because she's staking her claim on the royal authority because she's a granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and he's only an external leader, and he has to face the crisis. He gets expert spin doctor advice from Mamuchan, who may very well be Haman, and he solves the crisis to great, great success. You can read about that in the history of China or the history of the Incas. It wouldn't attract your attention at all. There are challenges, and people suffer crises, and there are smart people who give you advice, and sometimes there's success. It wouldn't attract your attention at all. A new queen has to be chosen, and it's a lottery, night after night, night after night. And who's chosen but this Jewish girl? Well, somebody had to be chosen. He wasn't going to do it forever. A lottery is an event designed to produce an event of very low probability. You have 1 million tickets, one ticket is chosen. It was 1,000,000 to 1 against that ticket. Does that make it a miracle? It's not a miracle because you have a natural process that's designed to produce a low probability event. So he explained it in those natural terms. Not a miracle at all. Low probability doesn't make something a miracle. The question is what resources you have to explain why the low probability event took place. She's chosen. Somebody had to be chosen. Whoever is chosen is 1 in 1,000. She was chosen. Absolutely no reason to think that's a miracle. The next thing that happens is people are plotting against Achashverosh's life. And Mordechai happens to overhear the plot. And he reveals it to Esther, and Esther reveals it to the king in Mordechai's name. And they catch the plotters and they kill them. Well, plots against people's lives happen quite often, especially if you're an autocrat. And they're usually discovered and defeated because otherwise it would hardly pay to be an autocrat. You'd have a short life. Now, it's reported to the king in the name of Mordechai, and he doesn't reward him. That's not obvious. That's not obvious. Doesn't reward him. Wouldn't you want to reward the person who saved your life so as to encourage people to save your life? Wouldn't I think of that as a reasonable strategy? But it's going to take me another 5 minutes to finish this. But the Jews are a conquered people, and they're a scattered people, and they have no province under their control. They aren't at one of the united provinces under Achashverosh, 127 provinces. And it could be that they're too insignificant to take into account, just as Haman thinks it's beneath his dignity to take revenge from Mordechai because he's a Jew. And you'll look small and petty and crude if you go after a Jew. Why do you even notice a Jew? That's why he goes after the whole people. So you read about this in the papers. They were plotting in their life, and then Mordechai heard of it. These things happen quite regularly. There's no reason to take any account of that. Fine. Then Haman becomes prime minister, and he has a vendetta against Mordechai, makes a vendetta against the Jews, and he convinces the king to sign a decree against the Jews, which he does, but he's impatient and he wants to kill Mordechai. He comes to the palace to have Mordechai killed. Up to here, I think this is just normal, accidental, random history. But that night, the king can't sleep. Why can't I sleep? I'm usually good at this. And then he says, bring me the Sefer Zichronos, by the way, not Sefer Divrei Hayomim, for those who know a little Hebrew. He didn't ask for the history book. He asked for the book of responsibilities, the memory book. Megillah Esther talks at the end of Megillah Esther about Divrei Hayomim. It's not a history book. Things that need to be done, outstanding obligations. And the royal servant starts reading, and it's open, the scroll is open to what happened years before when Mordechai saved the king's life. All of a sudden, the king says, wow, Mordechai saved my life. Did we do anything for Mordechai? Now it bothers him. And the servant says, well, nothing written here, sir. It's an empty page. Whoa, that's terrible. We ought to do something for Mordechai. Now, Haman is coming in to get the king to kill Mordechai, and the king now thinks, I've got to reward Mordechai somehow. At this point, I think the reader becomes a little bit suspicious. Come on, what's the probability of that? That's too melodramatic, it's too artificial. This no longer sounds like a real story. And guess who's queen? The Jew. Right there to save the Jews from Haman's plot. That's too contrived. I think if you write a novel with this plot and try to sell it to a publisher, the editor would say, you can't keep going on like this over here. It's just too unrealistic. The reader's not going to believe it. The reader's going to say, this is too incredible, too improbable to be sensible. It's not realistic. That's the whole point of the book. That's the whole point of the book. That at this point, it's just too incredible to be realistic. Realistic. It won't really happen in the real world that we're used to, we bank on, we understand, we can predict, we have real analogies for. It just isn't realistic. Correct. It isn't realistic. At this point, I think the reader says, this is too unlikely to happen. It's too unlikely to happen. Now you think, wow, so how did we get into this? Haman wants to kill Mordechai. Mordechai saved because he saved the king's life years before, and the king didn't reward him, and wrote down in the memory book that he did it and didn't reward him, and then forgot about it. Was that just accidental? That's how, on this night, and now on this night, he suddenly can't sleep. Every night he sleeps. This night he can't sleep. And instead of going to play polo or drinking some liquor, he decides to have the memory book read to him, and it just happens to be open just to that page about Mordechai, just as Haman is coming in. So was his inability to sleep just accidental? Was it his choice of the memory book accidental? Was it open to that page accidental? It's just too many accidents to save Mordechai's life. So then you have to say, so it must be that it was arranged he should hear about the plot. And it was arranged that, he tells it to Esther. Esther tells it to the king in Mordecai's name. And it's written down, and then he loses track of it and forgets it. That also has to have been planned. And then this night when he can't sleep is planned. And then he calls for the memory book, and the memory book was open to that page. All that has to be planned by some agency that's guiding the events. And then, since the queen is instrumental in changing the king's mind, you ask yourself, well, how did she get there? Oh, she got there from the banquet, and the rebellion of Vashti, and Vashti being taken down, and then being chosen as queen. So all of that now, the whole sequence you see, was planned to lead to this event. Now, here's where you have a picture of what I would call a miracle within nature. Each one of the events is natural. No water flowing uphill, and no ice bursting into flame, and no people who are deprived of food and drink for 6 years and stay alive. Nothing happens which says the laws of nature are being broken. But the dovetailing of the events is so unlikely, and it's so clearly planned to reach a certain result, you have to be blind not to see that there's an intelligent agency above and beyond the normal laws that is producing this. So here you have a subtle, what we call in Hebrew a shiluv, a subtle intertwining of nature on the one hand and the miraculous on the other. You don't have something like the crossing of the sea, or the manna, or the pillar of fire and pillar of cloud, where there are open breaches in the natural world and you see them with your eyes. Here, each of the events could be understood in perfectly natural terms, and then when you come to the denouement, you go back and say, no, that couldn't possibly be true. That could be the idea of a nature, of a miracle within nature. That's what I'm trying to explain, this concept which is unique to this miracle. No other miracle has this character. You wanted to ask something?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that this is, and I don't know if their relationship, maybe their relationship didn't have an effect on the story, so maybe it's not such a crazy thing, but I would say that it's maybe a little suspect that the guy who happened to hear, it's not a violation of nature, but the guy who happened to hear about the guy's plot against the king was Mordecai, who was related to Esther, who happened to be picked as the queen. I don't know if that relationship had an effect in his informing the king and helping save him. But yeah, so maybe that's a little, you know what I'm saying?
I did mention that as one of the features.
Yeah, as one of the features. I'm saying it's not so
But I didn't use it, so I don't know why it's not relevant to the description that I gave. I didn't use it as part of the.
Right. So you're saying it doesn't have an effect on.
I don't think so. I mean, the whole thing would have happened exactly the same way if she, if he had been a stranger to her.
Right, because he would have brought it independently.
Well, he had to get to her, so there'd be some reason why he could communicate with her, and she would believe him, and so that. But more than that, to be his first cousin and to be the one whom he raised, and maybe his wife, that I didn't use that. I don't think it plays any role in the fact that it's an unlikely coincidence.
Okay. I have another question. This is not related to, I'm saying it's more on the Purim story at large. Is there or does there have to be, but first of all, is there archaeological evidence for the Purim story? And second, does there have to be, how do you go about that?
Okay, that's very far afield, but there's a fellow named Landy who did a whole study of it, and it's published. And there is archaeological evidence for at least the general conditions that are described, including a picture of the king sitting in his inner sanctum with a long golden scepter, which is long enough to reach the door. There's an actual picture of that from ancient Persian records.
So I like the example with the spin, because as you said, it's so small scale, and there's so few other variables there that it's very hard to say that within the picture there's something coming and interfering with that. And yeah, you have to do a lot of work to upheave your system if you're trying to say that there's a factor within the picture that you're not witnessing, which is causing that strange reaction. I'm not sure if we have that so much in the Purim story case. I mean, it doesn't sound great, but I might, because I don't have as much monitoring, it's harder to like rule out a ridiculous possibility, like aliens coordinating everything from above, or potentially, the thing I wrote down, oh yeah, and that there is an outside factor within the picture that could be occurring because I don't have as much of a comprehensive view of the situation because it's happening in the world and it's harder to monitor.
Okay, I think that's a reasonably fair comment, but I think what I intended was this. The picture I'm talking about now is the social, political, economic, psychological picture of how human society operates. Something outside that picture has to be operating here. Now, you're going to put it up to aliens? Okay, I'm not.
I definitely grant the intelligent hand. Like
Okay, so that's all I want. I mean, and that's what I want to say is that the normal, natural procedures that govern the way human interactions work aren't sufficient to explain this. To go all the way to the infinite creator of the universe, no, I'm not going there. But the intelligent hand. Now you see, you understand. We're not considering a situation where we're taking the events of Purim story and subtracting everything else divine from the whole of history. There's a Big Bang, and evolution works, and random mutation, everything else, and then just these events, and then we're trying to infer. So at that point, I think you're right. What can we give it this from this alone? Well, something else is going on. What else could be? Well, the sky's the limit. It could be aliens. It could be whatever you like. But this is now a question of whether it's a miracle within the framework of our history. Is this also a miracle, or is this just accidental? And at that point, I think you'd have to say that it was. When I said a person would have to acknowledge divine agency, I'm crediting the person with the concept of what the divine is, otherwise he can't understand the proposition. Right? You got to know that there's that. So I think that's all I want. I want it to be a miracle within the context of Jewish history. Yeah.
Could one not potentially argue that all events are one random possibility out of a million happening, and then make the same trace back to all events that led up to that, and claim every natural event therefore to be a miracle?
I understand. Let's try. I have a suggestion. When you're doing philosophy and doing grand propositions with abstract terms, to test your understanding of what you're talking about, bring it down to a very simple example and see if it works. Okay. Now, so every event is one out of an infinity of possibilities, right? So I'm flipping the coin. Tell me the infinity. I think there's heads and tails, and maybe a 1/trillionth chance of standing on its edge. That's 3. Where are the rest of the billions and billions of possibilities?
Like, for example, if I walk into a random store in a random town while traveling through, say hello to the random cashier who happened to be there, shake his hand. If we look back at every little event that happened there, I shook this man's hand, ended up in this store in this town, he ended up in this store in this town. I had to have, let's go years ago, I had to have been born, my parents had to have randomly met. Every event that ever occurs in the world, in life, is seemingly a random event that could have happened differently in any number of ways. So I could look at any mundane thing happening. I met that man in the store and shook his hand, and trace back all the different things that had to lead to his life, bringing him there to that moment, leading me there to that moment, to me shaking hands, and say, by the same logic, and say, okay, it's a miracle.
Well, I don't see why. I mean, if I ask, the room is dark and suddenly there's a flame, I want an explanation for that. And I say, well, he had a cigarette lighter. He pushed a button and the flame appeared. Haven't I explained why the flame happened? Haven't I explained it in such a way that, given that he pressed the button, nothing else could have happened? Maybe he wouldn't have been born, that's true, but that doesn't stop me from explaining this event on the basis of this cause. I don't have to explain everything in the world to explain this event on the basis of this cause. Given this cause, this had to happen. They ask me, but why did the cause happen? That's an interesting question. Okay, I can explain that also. I can trace each thing back, and each one back. And it wasn't a 1 in a trillion chance that your parents should get together, because he went to this high school and she went to that high school. They both played tennis. They both ended up in the tennis courts, right? So All of these things, could they have happened otherwise? Sure, they could have, but on the other hand, if you ask why this happened on the basis of its causes, it was brought about in a way that's almost necessary. When you're talking about explaining something, you don't have to explain the existence of the whole world. All you have to explain is what made this particular event take place. Once you know what made this event take place, you know that it couldn't have, given what preceded it, it couldn't have happened. That's what explanation does. You don't have to explain everything. What you do is you explain this event on the basis of its cause. Now I know why it happened. I know how to prevent it next time. That's very important. It gives me a lot of information. I'm not lost as to what to do next time. If pushing the button on a lighter causes a flame, everybody who comes in is going to put his lighter in the box. Otherwise, he's going to jail. Then I won't have flames because I know how to stop them. So it's not as if it's all random and all miracle. I know it gives me practical control of the outcome because I know what causes it.
Or was the Purim story, is the idea of saying not that the Purim story was all natural events that on their own didn't have any strange explanation to their cause?
No, I'm not saying they were natural. I'm saying that if you didn't see the end result of the sequence, and you took each event by itself, you could think you could explain it naturally. You would have no reason to say that it was miraculous. Remember, I defined a miracle as an event which an honest, open-minded person would have to acknowledge that it's divine agency. If all you had in front of you was the party and the downfall of Vashti, you would not have to acknowledge that that was divine agency. If all you had in front of you was the plot and Mordecai overhearing the plot, you would not have to acknowledge that was divine agency. If all you had was Esther being chosen to be queen, you would not have to acknowledge that that's divine agency. But when you get to Mordecai being saved, because of the fact that it was forgotten, the Sefer Zechronos and all the rest of that, then at that point you'd say that's not something which happens by accident. And then you go back and you say, aha, so I made a mistake. I thought that all these things were natural, and in fact I now see that they're not natural. By the way, there's a certain subtlety here which has become very famous because of the interaction between Thomas Nagel and Sharon Street. There's a big difference between saying it can be explained naturally versus saying that it is explained naturally. Can be explained naturally means I have these pieces of nature, I have this event, and these pieces of nature working by themselves can produce this event. That doesn't say it did, just as it can. Take a lottery. A lottery has 1 million tickets. Any ticket could be chosen. So when one ticket is chosen, we say, that's what lotteries do. They produce this kind of process where a very improbable event happens, and happens this way. That doesn't say that the lottery wasn't fixed, and it wasn't pre-chosen that this ticket should be chosen. It doesn't say that that didn't happen. It says, I don't need to assume any intelligent intervention in order to explain why it happened. But that doesn't mean it really happened that way. Some lotteries are fixed, aren't they? Some lotteries are phony, aren't they? So the gigantic difference between saying the resources of nature can explain it versus saying the resources of nature are the actual explanation. This was the big debate about evolutionary explanations of morality. One of the mistakes that Thomas Nagel used against Sharon Street was that she says there's an evolutionary explanation, and his response, in essence, was evolution could explain it, but it would have the result that no laws of morality are really objectively correct. I'm more convinced that the laws of morality are objectively correct, and therefore I'm going to say that although evolution could explain it, it doesn't explain it. In fact, it didn't happen that way, or it didn't happen only that way. There are extra factors that evolution is not taking into account, and those factors result in the conclusion that they are objectively correct. So there's a big difference between saying it could be and it is. Even Quine made this mistake in the beginning of his masterpiece, Word and Object, and he talks about infant learning, and he says, here's a scheme within stimulus response that could explain infant learning through reinforced motivation, Skinner type stuff. And then he says, now of course we don't know that the details happen that way, but since I know that a reinforcement program could produce a result, for philosophy's purposes, it's not necessary to know the actual details of how it really was done. All I know is it could be done that way, and then I can go on and say that it's a reinforced stimulus type of result. Well, that's not really correct, because when you try to fill in the details, you may discover that there wasn't enough time, or there wasn't enough energy, or the population wasn't big enough, and it wouldn't work. You really do need to work out the details, because if so, you don't know that in the real world it's possible. You have a theoretical model which could produce it, but you don't know whether the real world supports that theoretical model. Just like problems with evolution. They talk about, well, there are billions of years. Okay, and maybe you need trillions, and you haven't got them. Until you tell me the details and make the calculations, it could be that there isn't enough time. It's just not obvious there's enough time. If you don't give me the details of the process, and now, what's his name at Yale? Professor Gelernter of computer science, believes that the folding of proteins and functional proteins is so unlikely that there isn't enough time. There isn't enough time. You just didn't know that that was part of the process that you needed, so you couldn't calculate the time, and now we calculate there isn't enough time. So it's a very different proposition to say it could be or it is, and very often people lean on it could be, and then they think of it as is, and then they draw their conclusions, and it's a mistake. It's a logical mistake, yeah.
Now, I'm not particularly committed to this position, but couldn't someone say, rather, if this argument isn't needed to suggest the fact that there's a miracle, just because the fact that the Jews could have died and that didn't, would imply that God had a plan for them not to die to begin with, or guided them out of annihilation.
You're offering a simpler argument to the same conclusion? Is that what you're doing?
I'm saying, can this also be used as an argument?
They could have died and they didn't? Let's see. The emperors don't always succeed in what they want to do. Conditions change. Ask Putin about his, minuscule military actions will take 3 weeks, and Kiev will be destroyed, and the government will be dead, and he'll take over Ukraine. So it isn't as if all emperors, in all cases, always succeed in what they do, and this would be the only case in history where the emperor failed to do what he wanted to do. Why would it be a miracle? They wanted to kill us all, and they didn't succeed. And Hitler wanted to kill us all, didn't succeed, right?
So there could be natural explanations as well for Jewish survival, at least in this particular instance. I don't know, just the particular instance, or there could be natural explanations in which Jews could be faced with annihilation, but then happen to not be annihilated.
I think so. Not particularly Jews. It could have been Persians or Gypsies, or
Mm-hmm.
There still are Romani peoples, even though Hitler went after them also. And the population was smaller than our population, and they didn't get totally wiped out. I don't hear how the argument would go. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
I can't declare certainty that it couldn't be made, but I don't hear how the argument would go.
The only reason for proposing it was just wondering whether or not, in cases in which the possibility exists, and the fact that annihilation didn't occur, we would then suggest that it would have to be God. But if you're saying
No,
you're suggesting that,
no,
if you're not suggesting that, then
I wouldn't say that.
that's all.
I just want to make some remarks to finish off about the importance of this. There's no question that some periods of history and some circumstances are characterized by many, many more miracles than others. The 40 years in the wilderness was continuous miracles. And through Jewish history, up to the end of the first temple, miracles were very plentiful. In particular, prophecy was plentiful. And the first temple had in it continuous miracles. After that, they didn't have the miracles anymore. They didn't have prophecy anymore. Different periods of history, different circumstances have different miracles, and different types of miracles. So we tend to think of miracles as circumstantial. And I think that's right. To a great extent, they are circumstantial. Now, in particular, the land of Israel is a place which is far more characteristic of miracles than any other place in the world. Same with prophecy. What then would a person's attitude be if he's in exile? And when prophecy has ceased, even in the land of Israel. So the natural world seems to be closing in. And a number of Jews have, failed to live up to the expectations. One could imagine a sense of abandonment. Abandonment. These are conditions under which God doesn't manifest himself miraculously. He doesn't. What does it mean for his management of history? Not clear. Not clear. We do have verses that talk about the hiding of the divine face. We do know that the place of the Shekhinah, of God's presence, is the land of Israel. That's where we're supposed to be. Our Jewish law regards our presence elsewhere in the world as the presence of guests who can be removed. They'll have no claim to citizenship. So it's not unreasonable to feel abandoned. That's why it's absolutely crucial that this miracle takes place outside of the land of Israel, when the temple is destroyed. There is some prophecy at the time, but the abandonment and the being in the face of the destroyer for 2 generations could lead to a sense that a lack of closeness, concern, care, management, observation. When a miracle takes place like this, it causes a fundamental revolution in your picture of your circumstances. And the crucial revolution, I think, is here are events that looked completely natural and aren't. What shall I say about the rest of my circumstances that look completely natural? They too could be really not natural. Indeed, when you think of the concept of hiding, you only hide something that's present. Something that's absent doesn't need to be hidden if it's somewhere else. So if you're hiding God's presence, that means he is present. You're just hiding him. He's present in such a way that you can't see that he's present. And that inability to see may be your failure. So if you have precious diamonds, there are at least 2 different ways to hide them. You can dig a hole in the backyard, and bury them underground. Or you can take some pieces of glass, and some pieces of marble, and some pieces of crystal, and put them in a dish on the dining room table, together with a couple of plants, and among the marble and glass and crystal, toss in a few diamonds. No one will notice, because it's just junk, right? That's the way it looks. And it's right in front of you, but you don't know how to look at it to see what's there. That's, I think, a picture of what's going on. That from our point of view, what happens in history is all a matter of divine providence, but it's run in such a way that the sequences of events could be understood in natural terms. They could be explained naturally. And this miracle indicates to us that we should think that they could be, but aren't really natural. That, I think, is the Kedushas Levi, who is the author of this very erudite essay, which I'm not really communicating to you because it's too specialized, wants to say the blessing that we say, he did miracles for our ancestors in those days at this time. Literally, there's a contrast between those days in the past and at this time now. You say, Rabbi, it just means this time of year. It's the same date. It's an anniversary of an event. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But he says there's more meaning to it. It was in those days at a time like ours now. Just like ours, where we are surrounded by what looks like a completely naturalistic, random, accidental environment. And in those circumstances, that's when this miracle took place. And that should give us a little inspiration to understand the conditions under which we live. Yeah.
I don't know if what you were saying would answer this question or not, but if the miracle that occurred wasn't a natural one, or couldn't be explained through natural means, wouldn't that serve as stronger evidence or stronger proof? And if so, you easily have a skeptic saying, well, these events, since they're possible, therefore could occur naturally, and therefore that could give us reason to think it occurs naturally.
if the events were clearly miraculous, like the crossing of the sea and so forth and so on, what would it give us more proof of? Seems to me it would give us more proof of sometimes God intervenes, and the rest of the time he doesn't intervene, and the rest of the time is not under his control or direction, or it has no sense or pattern to it. That means you're not making the point that I'm making at all. You're losing the point entirely. But still, 99% of your history and the history of the nation is without control, without direction, right? My point is to affect the 99%. That would be more than 1%.
Wait, so are you, just to clarify, you're saying that like the splitting of the sea and stuff like that can be explained naturally, like Harsinas? You're not saying that?
No. Certainly not. Certainly not. No.